Hello. Ooh. So I might just move slightly away from the mic. My name is Genever. I'm a beef and sheep consultant. I come from South Lincolnshire. I specialise in farming systems. What does that mean? I like talking to farmers in fields about beef, sheep, grass, forage, and how it all fits together in a bit of the puzzle that is sometimes livestock systems. I'm also a mixed farmer from South Lincolnshire, so we've got grass lays in arable rotation, and my main sort of objective with farmers is to drive that performance on farm and really thinking about utilisation of grass and forage. So I'm not necessarily, sometimes we can use other different supplements, but generally really focusing on grazed grasses and forages. And one of my main objectives really is to get livestock back into arable. As sort of many generations of mixed farmers, I don't think it's particularly novel or interesting, but at the moment we're trying to really focus on how we can do it, what type of animals works best, what type of system, and how we work through the practicalities of generally water and fencing seems to be a big challenge a lot of the time. In terms of my experience, so I'm involved in carbon corning, which is sort of like Groundswell's really weird relation that you don't really want to be associated with. It was meant to happen last August, but we had to cancel it because of various reasons. And that's trying to get more livestock farmers, mainly livestock farmers, involved in regenerative techniques and sort of working on that sort of really positive idea of how we can, the benefit of livestock from a grass, on a grass-only farm, but also how do we get it onto a mixed farm. I'm also the founder of Carbon Dating, which sounds dramatic, but is trying to get farmers who have stock connected with farmers who need stock but don't necessarily want to own them or touch them or do anything with them. So we're trying to build like a bit like a dating agency, connecting those two farms together, or farmers together. And the reason why I'm standing up here mainly is I'm a coordinator of the Innovative Farmers Field Lab, which is looking at extended grazing of lucerne in arable rotation over in North Norfolk. So as part of that project, and that idea came from farmers trying to understand what is the potential of lucerne in that high pH, low rainfall sort of situation, how can it work with sheep, bringing data from or research from New Zealand and implementing over here and seeing what we're finding. Last year it was the only green thing on farm. This year there's lots of green things and everything's growing like mad. And this year we're comparing it with herbal lays, grass clover lays, and lucerne in terms of stock performance. And for the slight geeks in the I also introduced Farmax, so that's a way of sort of understanding livestock systems and modelling them and look at scenarios of and what's the best thing we can do in terms of that land area and how we can incorporate livestock in and make sure that it fits together as a system. So that's my experience.
Well, morning everybody. My name's David Miller. I'm the farm manager from Wheat Sheep Farming. I feel there must be another David Miller out there somewhere who likes animals, because I'm not sure why I'm here. I think I must be a conscientious objector or something. We're an all arable farm, all combinable crops. We farm about 700 hectares for 3 different farmers. We made the change to some regenerative principles from 2010, so we've been at it for about 11 years. And the whole farm has been no-till and cover crops from 2015. I trawled back in my phone through the photos, which there was about 4,000, and got back to 2014 when there was a picture of some sheep. And I remembered we did have some sheep on the farm. One of the first years we had full-scale cover crops, very dense cover crops, 40 tonnes of green matter a hectare, so really very thick. And we hadn't got a disc no-till drill at the time. We'd still got a tine drill, so we had to have something to remove some of the green matter before we could drill our crops. And somebody told us sheep was a good thing. We had no idea whether what we put in the cover crops was good for sheep. We had a guy come down, a lovely guy from Wales, who brought 10 sheep down, put them in a field with a bit of electric fence around them, came back a week later and they were all still alive, so we figured out it must be okay for them. So we ended up with about 2,500 sheep, which took everything absolutely down to the ground. That was the spring of 2015. We then went to a disc drill in the autumn of that year. So I think really my point is that we are covering 4 of the 5 principles of regen ag. So we have a very diverse rotation. We have soil cover, residue management, minimum soil disturbance, and also we try and have living roots in the soil at all times. So 4 out of 5, I think we're sort of getting there. Our system at the moment is very, very simple. So the 700 hectares is only myself that works there full time. We have a couple of guys that come in, harvest time, drive a combine, this sort of thing. The system is very simple, very little labour, very little machinery. So I think from my perspective, if we introduce livestock, we may compromise that system. I think flying flocks are a great idea, but having a shepherd understand, and I hope everybody here is not one of these people, but having a shepherd understand that you don't necessarily want your cover crop grazed to the ground, that you still want 50% left. Doesn't always go down very well with it. The other thing that concerned me was when we first started to get our soils moving in the right direction with the no-till, the last thing we wanted was a wet winter and be committed to having somebody's sheep going across these cover crops. So I think as the soil has moved on, we may be more able to sustain that on the soil. So before I get lynched by everybody else, I think we'll call that a day and move on. Thank you very much.
Morning everyone. I'm George Hosier and we farm, family farm 625 hectares in Wiltshire. As a family we've been farming there for 100 years and we've always had cattle on the farm. Until 1991 it was always dairy cows. Since then it's been the beef suckler herd. They were, for most of my lifetime, confined to a bit of permanent pasture up on the chalk. But when we made our change to no-till and introduced cover crops in 2015, we started reintroducing the cattle onto land that hadn't seen livestock for, well, 40 odd years, at least. So the main way we've reintroduced into the arable rotation is through cover crops, and just with cattle. We've dabbled with sheep a little bit. I don't really get on with them, sorry Jane. So I mean, I know a lot of people will say cattle on arable ground in the winter will make an awful lot of mess, a lot of poaching. We move them every day, and in moving them every day, any poaching that does happen recovers quickly. And the further and further we get through the sort of move away from cultivations, the better the ground holds up in a wet time to the livestock, and the quicker it recovers afterwards. So when we've got a good tall cover crop, as David said earlier, you know, the more biomass you grow, you've got to manage it somehow, and we find that the cattle do the best job. We could spread off early. We don't like to spread off early. We like to keep the living root there for as long as possible. And so So yeah, we run the cattle over all of our cover crops, which is about half our arable acreage, about 200 hectares every year, goes into cover crops. And then we've grown our herd since 2015. Well, we actually started growing it more in the last 3 or 4 years, but so we're introducing more herbal lays into our rotation. It's a great break to get away from chasing blackgrass around with rotations. A 4-year grass lay will have a significant impact on grass weeds. I mean, just a few figures. No one else has thrown figures at you, so I thought I would. The changes we've made, we haven't made any one change on its own. We went, as I said, we went no-till in 2015, and we started introducing cover crops at the same time. We started reintroducing livestock into the arable parts of the farm at the same time. And then a couple of years later, we started we cut insecticides completely, we cut P&K fertilizer, bagged P&K fertilizer completely. In the last 3 years, we've significantly reduced our nitrogen fertilizer. So before we made any changes, we were buying in the equivalent of 105 tonnes of nitrogen a year. We're now buying in 30 tonnes. Our diesel use is more than halved. We were using 70,000 litres of diesel, we're now using 30,000. Fungicides. Most of our wheat hasn't had any fungicide yet this year. Hopefully it won't. But before we were a standard 4 fungicide program, and we haven't used any insecticides for the last 5 years. And yes, our average wheat yield over the last 5 years is probably down half a tonne on what it was before, but in 2019 we actually had our best year ever. So we've cut our costs, but we haven't massively cut our output. And whether that's partly down to having the animals in the system, or whether we'd have got there if we'd kept the animals out, who knows? Because I didn't make any one change, but I believe that the livestock are putting more in than they're taking out.
Right, good morning everybody. I'm JoFranklin. The eagle-eyed of you in the front row might notice I've got Rob's badge on. Long story, but I'm not Rob, I am Jo. So I've got 3 slides and 3 minutes to tell you everything we've done in the last 7 years, and I'm not going to achieve it. So if you want more details when all this is finished, our stand is just across the way. You've also got a flyer on your seat which gives you a lovely breakdown of our figures. There are figures out of our own reconciled data, so they are as true as they can be. We're very open, we're very honest. Any questions, we're not afraid to tell you exactly what's going on. The writing's very small because there was a lot to write. Rob and I were from farming families, went out into industry. I was an agronomist, he was an engineer, not the sort of useful spanner engineer, the sort of design stuff engineer, which hasn't proved so useful going forward. My agronomy has obviously been vital, so yeah. We started off with 200 sheep, which we bought culls from my father-in-law at a very inflated price, if you ask me. And we started off with 60 acres, and he said, when this fails, guys, I'll come back and get the sheep. And that was, 7 years ago. We're now up to 2,000 of our own. We've got 500 B&Bs with us, and we are setting a sheep dairy up, so it can't be all bad. We've imported genetics from New Zealand ourselves, from the Nithsdale flock, which has the widest pelvic aperture in the world, I think. We're all fully recorded. We've moved to DNA shepherding to make life at lambing much, much easier. So we compare with SIL, which is the biggest amount of Romneys recorded in the world, with the biggest breed recorded in the world, and we compare with them. And we've just come back with some figures this year that show our breeding is catching them fast. So they're actually inviting us to put our DNA into their database, which is quite a privilege to be invited by the Kiwis to send sheep genetics back. So we're proud of that. So we're moving fast. We're tenant farmers. We started off with the 60 acres. We're now up to 2,500. Arable as well. So we've got full control over all the mixing that we're doing, all the integrating that we're doing. So we're changing stuff up all the time to make it better all the time. And we think we've just about cracked it. We've got a cracking team now. It was just Rob and I on all those sheep and all those acres until about 18 months ago. And then we started finding these fantastic people who wanted to come and work for us. So we're very, very lucky now to have a team. We're at full strength, we're 6. So they're all young, which makes us feel very old when you get that CV through, and they were born in sort of 90s and then even 2000s. It's a bit upsetting, but we do say when we're out as a team, it does look like we've got our own children, the 3 you can see there, and it does look like we've got 3 kids from a previous marriage as well. I like to think that'd be Rob because he's older than me. So we're big into data. As I've said, we record with SIL, with DNA. We've got all the buzzwords and names and companies that you'd expect. Our rotation is a winter crop, spring crop, winter crop, spring crop. To keep the blackgrass on the move. The spring crops have a cover crop that we graze in front of them. And we do that on a sort of paddock size cell system. So we draw a map up before we graze. So the shepherds know exactly what order they've got to do it in, so that we don't ever have 2 pens next to each other. So when the pikeys release the dogs through the pens, we've got half a chance of putting them back. You wanted the downsides as well. Our cover crops we've played around with. The Romney's a fantastic grazing animal and eat pretty much anything, do very well off it. But we've settled with oats and berseem clover because at one point they were ticking a lot of the various boxes. We tried to do various things under various schemes, quite a lot with affinity water. And the simplest way to make sure we were ticking all the right boxes for all the right schemes was that mix. It's since changed, but that was originally where it came from. We did used to grow a lot of mustard straight. They did very well on that. And on our chalk, which is all pH 8 and above, that was probably doing us quite a favour. And we actually also grazed a lot of stubble turnips. I have to say that because our very generous landlord is at the back there. Thank you, Ralph. And we've just moved to a Missouri drill. So as we were coming off the chalks, we're very fortunate. We can probably drill them straight behind, providing we get a week of dry weather. So we were ploughing, pressing and drilling, which was a bit of a sledgehammer to crack a nut. The soil underneath was really good condition, but the sheep do leave a little pad in the top. So we needed to deal with that, and that's how we were doing it. We knew it was too much. Our new arable manager, Monty, introduced us to the idea of strip till, which I don't know if I'm allowed to say that here or not. It's not direct, but it does very well. So we've had that in lots of trials. We've had the Claydon as well. We're very, very impressed with what it's done, so much so that we bought one the other day. And it really does look like the future for us. So I think I've already covered most of this. We are New Zealand Romneys. We've got, they're the ultimate arable sheep. They respect electric fences. They've got good feet. We don't touch them for feet. They've got selected for FEC scores, maternal ability. So yeah, if you want something easy, you can programmable, look after. We could write any arable farmer. They're very simple. Like an agronomist will write you a set of recommendations. I could write you a set of recommendations. This is what you do to these sheep on these dates. And other than a few hung lambs at lambing, you'll be pretty much good to go. So that's us and what we do.
Well, how to follow those 4. A massive breadth of experience in sort of building their businesses over a number of years. I'm going to take chair's privilege, and I'm going to ask one question to all 4 here, just to kick things off, and then we'll switch over to, stick your hands up, and I'll try and field what's going to be like a quite interesting set of questions, a bit like an England cricket batsman trying to field everything from the edges of the field. But so my question to everybody, I guess, in just kicking this off in terms of conversation, really is going to be, what do your neighbours think and say about what you're doing? You've all made significant changes, and I'll be really interested to know what your sort of local neighbouring farmers, what's their passing comment about what you're doing, David?
Probably got to be a little bit careful because we've got some neighbours in the back of the tent here, but obviously they're coming around because they've come here. So I think we had some fairly epic fails in the first years that we were into cover crops and no-till, which I think stick in a lot of people's minds. We've come a long way since then. I think we know a little bit more about what we think we know what we're doing. So I think that the neighbours have been sceptical, but I think they're now coming to realise that there may be something in it. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
I'm I suppose slightly different, but the farmers I tend to work with enjoy that. But part of the reason why they're doing it is to wind people up. They like the fact that they're the odd ones, but actually people are coming around and they want to come and see. So I think it's part of quite a big character of the people who want to challenge what they're doing from an innovative perspective. They're not afraid to stand up and be a bit different, and through that they're learning. And what I really like about them is the openness to go and share that with others and the willingness to go and learn from others.
Well, my wonderful neighbours, I do need my lift home, by the way, very sceptical to start with, but as I say, at least one of my neighbours is here today, so hopefully they're coming round. Hopefully what we're doing is making them see that it does work and they are coming around.
We graze for lots of our neighbours now, so I think they're quite supportive. We've set somebody not too far away out with their own flock, so they're quite on board. And the best bit is our neighbours are actually this farm here. We're just over the hill, so anything we do looks quite mundane and normal.
Thank you all. So let's. I'm sure there are some burning questions from the floor. What I'll ask you to do is keep your questions fairly brief if you can and direct. Who the questions to, or whether it's the entire panel, and maybe if you wish, you can put a bit of context to it and just say, where you're from, what your name is. That would be really helpful as well. So to the floor, are there any questions? Question at the back over there with a hat on.
This is Jo really, because she's good at figures. So a lot of my landlords, so I'm a grazier, and a lot of my landlords have arable land, and they are interested in the principle of bringing cover crops, grass, and animals into their rotation, but they want the same returns that they get from an arable crop. And so my question to you is, what is it worth to an arable farmer to have livestock in their rotation, pounds and pennies?
So we look at it a little bit differently, and some of the costs I'm going to talk about are in here, because we use the mid-tier to facilitate grazing on wide-scale arable. As I said, because we're FBT tenants, we're commercial rent, so all of our arable ground comes under that. And the sheep in their own right to pay a rent doesn't cover it. So we use the mid-tier to put a GS4 and then top it up with a nil-fert supplement to get them £500 a hectare return, which then covers our rent on our farm. If you've got an owner-occupier, it's a very different discussion, which we're not fortunate enough to be in that bracket. So that's going to depend on how they feel about the long-term effect over their soil and over their ground. We've worked out the reason we keep a very specific pen size and keep them on it for a specific amount of time, so we can actually quantify the nutrient going back from the sheep rather than just 20 kilos, which is the fairly normal way. So yeah, that's your sum really. But yeah, you're not going to fight with their profitable break crops. If they can afford, if we were owner occupiers, we'd put a really chunky fertility building lay round and graze that very intensively, but we can't, because we've been fortunate to pick up a lot of permanent pasture very cheaply around here. That's where our sheep are. if we lost a big chunk of that overnight, we would the economics would then change, and we would then look to put them on a very intense area around the arable. But we haven't done those figures recently to give you a good answer.
Okay, question. Tim at the back.
Tim Sellers, I happen to be an organic farmer, but it's not really relevant to this. My question is, I agree wholeheartedly with the principles of introducing stock onto personal arable units. Agronomically, it's spot on. What concerns me is if everybody here chooses to have sheep, for example, and they persuade their friends to have sheep, that over the next few years, the market, at a time when sheep numbers are probably going to drop in the UK, how is this going to square up? How is it going to work?
So the challenge in a lot of the work I've done is not about encouraging, although Joe wouldn't like this, everybody to go and buy their own sheep. I think there's big opportunities, and why carbon dating is a good idea is because it's moving sheep from areas where you'd have to put a higher level of feed in. So you're buying a lot of feed in, buying a lot of straw in, and those animals are moving to the feed and where the straw's coming from. So I think it more of as about a redistribution, not necessarily millions more sheep, because I agree, I don't think that is the justified way of doing it. It's about moving, basically inputs going into hill and upland areas and moving them elsewhere. It's very traditional ways of moving animals around. The challenge we've got, easier for sheep, for cattle is TB. So that's why sheep tends to be in the conversation a lot more.
So using a military term, it's very much about redeployment rather than actually having all the animals in the west and all the crops in the east, about how we might be able to mix that. Before we move to the next question, David, obviously you've tried some of this. You've redeployed animals onto the farm, to an arable farm, and you've had a range of experiences. The one that strikes me is skills, about having the skills to manage those livestock. How did you address that?
We have no skills with livestock whatsoever, so we totally relied on the shepherds. The guy from Wales had a local chap who would look after them. Basically, if we saw them somewhere where they shouldn't be, we made a phone call and they sorted it out. So, no, the skills gap, if everybody was to do this, would be enormous. But I think we've spent 40 years moving all of our livestock over to the west of the country. You're not going to move it back to the east in a matter of weeks, months, or a few years. It's got to be a very gradual process, in my opinion.
Through Think, I farm in West Midlands. We've been direct drilling for about 8 years now. We've tried 2-year days. We have a dairy farmer who will buy the grass on us. But what we struggle with without the use of insecticide is direct drilling weeds back into that lane. It all establishes nicely and grows, and then it just disappears. So grass and pests have it. I don't know what the panel are doing to get around this problem. We've actually ploughed, although we can direct drill it, we ploughed our lane out this last year and put rain in to avoid the grass and pests having the weeds. Well, we haven't done it. Let's see how you get around the problem.
Well, what we've done in the past, coming out of grass, which has worked successfully, is peas in the spring. So we put it into peas, and then it goes into wheat the following autumn, and that's worked really well.
Yeah, so wheat after grass is a no.
Well, I was advised very early on that wouldn't work. And I tried the peas route and it worked. Equally, I think this year we've got 2 fields coming out of grass, so we're going to do one with winter beans and one with peas in the spring.
I'm assuming your comment is around sort of leather jackets, wildworm issues from grasslands.
Very much so, very much so. In the olden days, you always sort of sprayed the dirt down when you came out of grass. But quite rightly, we don't do it now, but it is very, well, we've actually put rape after grass this spring, and that looks okay, but it sounds like a simple thing.
So interested to know if anybody else in the audience has had similar issues. Anybody else that's had problems with introducing sort of grass breaks into the rotation where they've experienced particular sort of leather jacket wildworm pest problems? Hands up from the floor. Everyone's too shy, aren't they? Yeah, so, yeah. Interesting, so agronomically, it's the crane fly that's laying in September that's causing the problem. So having grass days that are not too long helps, and actually having perhaps more clover and less grass can also help towards that. But then there's a nutritional balance which you need to think about with the livestock. Maybe you've got a comment, Liz. Question? Experience from the back. Thomas.
We have exactly the same problem, but keeping the grass short going into winter in the late autumn, September has helped. And the humble heavy roll, I know it's a very difficult thing, the humble healthy heavy roll saved our crops last year for exactly the grain line. It's as simple as that. And when we crop the time, we rolled it, we reached the next. It was miraculous for such a simple process.
Question about Robert.
Robert Sullivan, farm manager up in North England. The philosophy of bringing livestock in is absolutely great from my point of view. The issue everyone will have is the lack of infrastructure, either lack of fencing or lack of water. How do you square that circle? Because we're looking at a massive investment there for returns that are not as good as what you're getting at the moment. So, any clever ideas would be great to see.
Okay, mid-tier is the first stop. So this flying flock thing's lovely, but ultimately you want to land behind permanent, because otherwise we do land behind a bit of electric, but you do need a much higher quality shepherd and dogs if you're going to do that, and higher quality of public than probably most of us have. So that's our starting point. So we make sure we've got somewhere when we're combining, we're not chasing sheep behind electric. You've got to plan your year. If you're going to be mixed, you've got to plan your year so that your stress points aren't all in the same place. You've got to be sensible. So we would have everything behind permanent for the whole, from lambing right through till September, when we've got the first of the covers ready and we're ready to go on them. We've put as much water in with the mid-tier as well as we can. Other than that, it's Bowsers. The sheep, it's not too bad unless they're milking, because they don't take a lot of water all winter. It's more for aesthetics, that the public are happy that you've got water out there than them actually drinking it all winter. So a bucket and a container if you have to. And other than that, it's just a case of getting your head round electric fence and getting stock that will respect it. So don't bring something down off the hills thinking you're going to keep it anywhere near your farm, you know. So yeah, if you buy stock from someone that uses electric fence a lot, they'll be respectful of it. If you get persistent problems with one getting out, mark it and get it gone, because it's only going to lead the others out. So it's just about keeping your fences good, keeping your batteries charged, whack a solar panel on, takes the pressure off the battery situation. So there's a lot you can do. It doesn't have to be onerous.
Yeah, I would sort of back that up, but also, I mean, you know, our cattle are behind an electric fence every day, so I would very happily have them in a field with just electric fence, a single strand of electric fence, keeping them in. But we do have, we're lucky, our farm is ring fence, and we have a good fence all the way around the farm now. But I'm not replacing any internal fences now. I'm doing it all with single strand electric fence. Water-wise, obviously, you know, we've got a fairly good infrastructure in there, but because we move the cattle every day, we've got a lot of temporary water troughs and temporary pipe, which we move to every field that we put the cattle in. It doesn't take long once you're all geared up for it. We've got a spindle on the side of our John Deere Gator, which we can wind up, pipe onto, and then just pull it out in the next field. And we've got 3 700 litre round water troughs, plastic water troughs, which we move around the farm. And it works well, and that means the cattle are always drinking clean water, which I think is also a real plus. Above the old infrastructure that we used to have of concrete water troughs that don't get emptied for sort of 15 years, which I'm sure happened in the past.
And I was once told by a Scottish grazier you can either spend time or money. And in quite a lot of the grass and forage systems, the return on investment in that investment in fencing and water systems can come back in 2 years. So yes, it is a chunk of money, I'm not disagreeing with that, but I think if we can manage it very effectively, we can make it back quite quickly compared to anything else we can buy onto farm.
There's a question back here, gentleman in the yellow shirt.
Just coming back to some of the things you were saying about managing graziers with arable farms, and I'm a grazier based in the southeast of England, and I moved there from Wales, and we run sort of thousands of sheep on various arable farms. We do a lot of cover cropping and temporary grass lays. It's fantastic. One of the big issues we have is that an awful lot of arable farms want to see stock on there, and they want to see someone else's stock, but sometimes they forget that the person with stock is running a business as well. So we get a lot of phone calls, quite late in the year. I've got 700 acres of cover crops. Can you come next week? We want you there for 6 weeks, and then can you go away? Well, if I'm bringing 2,000 sheep, and it costs me £2 a head each way in a lorry, and I've got to do all the electric fencing, and the same with, we get a lot of the idea of bringing sheep from the hills. That's fantastic, but as you said, they don't always fit the system. We get a lot of issues with people wanting a lot of stock at certain times of year or intensively, but then they sort of want the stock to just then disappear. And I don't have a shelf where I could put 4,000 or 5,000 ewes for certain months of the year when it doesn't fit in, and that's a big issue that we find, is that the farmer really wants the stock on, they don't want to take ownership of the stock, and they want someone else to build a system for them, and that's great, and that's really, really good. But it leaves us in a slightly difficult position to try and manage a year-round business. And we even find we do a huge number of store lands. We get a lot of phone calls that people want us to come in on greening crops, sort of 15th of January. Can you come in from the middle of January? Can you be gone from the middle of February? The crop's already gone over, there's not a huge amount of nutritional value. They still want a commercial rent for it, and they want us to turn up with 4,000 lambs for 4 weeks. And they vanish just before actually the lambs would be at the finishing point.
Thanks. Some really valid comments. For those people, I've been asked just by somebody outside the tent, text me, wonders of modern technology, so can I repeat the questions because they can't hear. So the comment here was very much about how managing the logistics and the flexibility between a grazier and an arable farm, about planning things in, about planning things out, maybe some experiences from the floor here in terms of how you've achieved that with some level of success.
And I think the carbon dating came from the idea of partnerships, which is the magic that sheep just don't disappear, and generally in the middle of February, just at quite a crucial time. Yes. So it's about thinking and having, I suppose it's having opportunity to understand whether there's permanent pasture on some of those areas that can also be utilised. And I think the challenge always is building up those partnerships, and if both parties are benefiting, and I think we're not quite there yet.
We've sort of found that it's interesting you said about bringing sheep down from the hills. We have a lot of store land with wild hills, a lot of tag sheep that come in, and there's always been a little element of, it's alright, there's loads of shepherds in Wales and loads of sheep, so we can just kind of come and pick them up at will. There'll always be someone willing to bring sheep down for a short-term basis, and obviously with a lot of the changes in upland agriculture, tree planting and sort of sheep production, that potentially isn't going to quite always be there, and some of these flocks need to exist in arable areas, stay in arable areas, in which case there needs to be more commitment to putting in year-round grass and that sort of stuff, not just the cover crops.
And I think Joe's point about the advantage of mid-tier, I mean, in terms of, I know the elms is some sort of mythical thing that's going to solve all of our problems, but there's potentials for those bits to help support investment and establishment of those crops.
Joe?
I do think it's all about relationships. Like we're fortunate to have our own arable block, so that brings us, that's the one that we will work around other landlords when they want us on. We always have that conversation very early, when you want us on, when you want us off, and we do our absolute best to stick to it. We come up with a plan of which fields we're going to graze in which order. We've had a couple of situations where we've been rapidly wrapping up fence in front of the plough, but we try not to make that too regular. But it is about being picky who you graze with. We're in a situation now where we're really not looking for anybody else to graze with. We don't graze with just anyone. If they haven't got the right attitude coming back, save yourself the heartache. and just don't do it. Just don't run those numbers, don't employ that extra person, and work with who you know there is a two-way relationship, and that goes from both sides.
Quick comment from David, and then there's a question from the floor.
Yeah, when we had our sheep in 2014, we didn't actually charge the guy in the end. We were very much looking at the benefits that we may be able to get from it. Unfortunately, it was just a bit too early in our system to continue that at the time. So we're really looking now, we've got all our cover crops are in mid-tier scheme, so we get payment for that. And also we are very much looking at cover crop species that we blend ourselves, which have more root activity than actually biomass on top. So we've changed that system around at the moment to suit what we're trying to achieve.
I'm just interested with George, how he's introduced cover crops and the management of cover crops with grazing suckling cows.
I'll repeat the question for those outside. So the management of different cover crops using cattle, and how you manage those cover crops with cattle systems.
Well, we graze them sort of on blocks between. We've got about 200 head of cattle in one big mob, and they're on between 1 and 3 hectares a day, depending on how much is there. We back fence them, so they're not going back on what they've been on before.
And the mixes?
Mixes, it's, well, a bit like David, we mix our own, and it varies across the farm and in different situations, but generally we have a cereal, normally oats, in there. We've got some brassicas, stubble turnips, radish, we've got vetch, facelia, buckwheat. It was the majority of the farm had about a 9-10 way mix last year.
And is that established after winter cereals and then going into spring crop?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So Ian, you've got a question at the back?
Have you ever grazed any sheep on growing winter cereals? And if so, do you use permanent grassland run back area when there's change?
So the question, again, for those outside, grazing of winter cereals and use of run back areas.
We don't, because we're lazy, and the speed we have to move them across versus the amount of fencing required, it's just too much hard work.
And George or David, have you had any experience of grazing winter cereals?
I contemplated it this year and I wimped out. By the time I needed it in the spring, I was a bit too late. The winter barley was a bit too forward to graze. But yeah, it's something, like Joe said, you've got to be very quick across it. And the infrastructure, it's doable. And I'm sure I will try it at some point. But I haven't done yet.
The only cereals we grazed when the sheep got out, really, so I don't think that counts.
Oh, we've had plenty of that.
So, question at the front here from the gentleman.
Outdated Warwickshire. Do you see a future with that glyphosate?
So the question for those at the back is, can you see a future without glyphosate? Discuss. We'll start on the right with David.
I think there should be a future without glyphosate. There's been a past without glyphosate, so how it fits into here a no-till system is not easy. But if push came to shove, I think there may be a little bit more cultivation done. But I think with some selective herbicides that we can use, I think there should be a future there. Hopefully we don't have to.
I think, well, the answer is yes, there has to be, doesn't there? In terms we have to be prepared for it. And I think the challenge at the moment is some people are trying it, but if it's still there, it's always the place to go back to. So Like, I know people are trying without it, but it is easier.
Yeah, like both so far, it's doable. Whether it would be, well, I don't think it would be 100% no-till, put it that way. I'm sure there'll be a need to cultivate in the rotation, but livestock are almost certainly part of that if you want to keep the tillage to a bare minimum, and probably sheep rather than cattle to graze it right down tight in certain situations.
I always feel really brave about we have very low Roundup use, and I always feel really brave about that till about May, and then I sort of regret it when the black grass starts popping through. And I think for us, we've taken on tenant farms, haven't been terribly loved for a lot of years. I think we started off with 1,200 heads of black grass a metre squared on one farm that we took on, 1,600 on the other. This year, it was going really well. The last few years with the droughts and things, we've had really, really, really low heads a metre squared, and then this year, on our worst patches, that's come back with a vengeance. But we've been down to, the only Roundup we've used has been in with our pre-em, so just tiny, tiny low rates to take anything that the IPM hasn't taken out to that point. And I think it's leaving us having to put up with a background population, and I think it just depends how comfortable you are with that background population and how big that can be. But with the winter spring, it's part of our plan to keep the blackgrass guessing. So if it wasn't for blackgrass, we feel fairly brave about it. We have bought an inter-row hoe, which we've been working on for a couple of years, and we're not organic, so it's just part of the system. But you realise it's not something that you can do every acre with several times a year. It's something that you've just got to do your worst spots. So we've sort of promised ourselves we're always going to get the winter oats with it to try and tidy them up. And I'd love to feel braver about it, but.
Question at the back here.
This one's from Joe. How are you finding the strip tillage? And what are you drilling into? What's your day? How are you managing in between rows?
So our starting point really was realising we were doing too much after the sheep. So the place we've really bought it for is on the light land after the sheep, and we've done some peas alongside all our normal stuff. And I was always taught peas you need to plough, you've got to get a good root, blah, blah, blah. And they look the Missouri strip looks absolutely phenomenal next to our conventional. It's we've got some thin hills, and you can see it in the ploughing, you can see it in the top down, and you can't see it in the Missouri. So we're really, really hoping we find that in yield at the other end. Fantastic establishment. So we have just put in for an affinity water project to look at a living mulch between the rows, because on the very light chalks here, you can't ever roll slow enough that you're not getting some soil erosion and some soil blowing up behind you, which you know when you're doing it doesn't feel right. But if you don't do that, it's such a puffy soil, you can't really get away with it. So we're looking at, on the lightest stuff, putting a living mulch in of a very slow growing clover. I think we've had to put a clover, a plantain, and I can't remember the last thing, 3 things that we're going to try in big blocks so we can get a combine through to get to yield, and see if we can keep that going, which would obviously mean no herbicides, which will be a big change for us. But we think we can put that in with the hoe, and just as an aside, we think we can start doing our phosphate as a proper side dress with the hoe as well. So I think it has got a lot of uses, a lot of potential.
George, I assume you're in the winter outside. Yeah. So you want the frost spots in your cover crops, are you then just supplementing with replaced hay or I mean, it's effectively, is it a daily move that means that you just don't upset the arable side of your life?
So the question, again, for those outside, is about supplementary feeding and daily moving of cattle and how George is managing that.
So yes, as the winter goes on, we supplement with round bale hay or silage, which we unroll out in the field. We've built a copy of a Greg Judy bale unroller, and yeah, I think that's basically.
Most of the cover crop diet, are you losing all your Hosier to frost?
Yes, parts of the cover crop stay. The stubble turnips and the oats are very much still there and green most of the winter. So there's always something in the cover crop that will withstand a winter. But yes, we do supplement it with hay or silage.
Many of us here today will have a keen eye and a keen interest in trying to improve our soils. So I've got a question really for the panel, which is, we've talked about animals above ground and how we're managing them. We haven't really touched much about what impact they might be having below ground. Let's start with David and move across. But what have you seen in terms of soil improvement, and how have you been monitoring or measuring that improvement over the last few years?
I think most of the improvements we're seeing are probably anecdotal. We haven't done a massive amount of physical measuring. We did take some baseline measurements of the actual soil life, so looking at microrhizal fungi, protozoa, nematodes, bacteria. So those have been GPS marked, so we can go back and see, which hopefully we'll do in a year or so's time. So very aware that what we've learned is that this process is very incremental, very slow. So what we didn't want to do was to go ahead and measure it 1 year, go back next year and find that we hadn't actually improved. So I think that's quite an important step, but we're certainly finding we're using less diesel to pull a drill. We're seeing much less erosion. The only bit that eroded this year on the whole of the 700 hectares was an old furrow that was in a field that we ran across with a livestock carrier, the only place on the farm that moved. So yeah, there's a lot of things that we can see are working well. We know that we're starting to measure invertebrates, so we're putting pitfall traps in cover crops and also in cash crops to try and understand what pests and predators we've got within that, and we're seeing that ratio is starting to change. So after having had a massive influx of slugs in the first year, very wet year, we're now finding a lot more harvestman spiders, carabid beetles, rose beetles, everything that helps to control slugs and sluggies. So we're finding slugs, which we actually look on as a benefit now, because we know we're going to have lots of predators there. So yeah, hopefully we've just become a strategic farm for the HDB, so there'll be a lot more measurement going on about what we're trying to do. So that stuff should be available as we go forward.
And yeah, I do quite a lot of digging holes with livestock farmers looking for earthworms and I know not necessarily in the greatest detail, but it's in terms of engaging with soil structure and soil health, thinking about it's not necessarily the magic that is livestock, it's about the rest of cultivation and also the diversity. And also we've all become mildly obsessed with dung beetles. So there's a lot more in terms of sort of understanding the role that they have, both in terms of obviously the decomposition of dung, but also fly control in animals. So it's how we can think about integrating all of that together and promoting that dung beetle population, also having advantages for animal health.
Again, like David, I'm more anecdotal than actual evidence to recording, but our organic matters have gone up, depending on the soil type on the farm. Between we've got some on the chalk which have gone from 8s to 10s, but on the green sands it started at 2.5 and we're now at 3. So it's gone up. Worm numbers have more than doubled. Other than that, it's all anecdotal. The drill pulls far easier through the soil than it used to. Holes, the livestock are better. I knew nothing about dung beetles until about 2 years ago, but we've definitely got more dung beetles now, or I noticed them more, probably more to the point. But yes, the soil is definitely more alive now than it used to be.
Sitting here silently panicking, wishing I'd got some really smart figures to pull out, but I don't. I did the soil food web course as part of my Nuffield 10 years ago. Learned to do all the microscope, just qualitative assessments. So when I came back from that, I sampled everything and looked at it all under microscopes. Was surprised just how dead all I was advising at the time. None of my old customers, no one's here. But how little life there was in a lot of arable soils was quite shocking. And our own, when we did our own, there was sort of either nothing, no bacteria, or very, very, very small numbers. And now when we do them, I can't count them because you've got to be a bit more qualified to do that, but there's a lot more going on. I think our soils were in such a bad state after so many years of neglect that we've got a big, big hill to climb. But yeah, blackgrass is on the decline. We've had to do drainage across all our farms that aren't the chalk, which has been time consuming, and obviously until you get that right, you can't really expect to build your biology that well.
So our time, thank you, Joe, our time has come to an end after a fascinating session for an hour. I'd like to thank you all for your participation and your questions, and to Joe, to George, to Liz and to David for sharing their experiences of what are some really interesting systems. And I'll leave you with a passing comment, which is actually it's a whimsical joke to finish, as you like to. The question is, how many farmers does it take to change a light bulb? What's change? And maybe Arables to Arable will bring about that kind of change. So I'd encourage you to develop those partnerships, come to talk to the panellists for their experiences, come talk to us at Raise Innovation for Agriculture, and have a great day.